The wind howled across the desolate mining camp as Victoria Mitchell pressed her back against the rough wooden planks of the supply shed, her hands instinctively cradling the swell of her belly beneath her worn woolen coat. Snow whipped through the gaps between buildings, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, she could hear the heavy footsteps of men searching for her. Their voices carried on the bitter air, crude and threatening, discussing what they would do when they found the pregnant woman who had dared to defy their ultimatum. "She can't have gone far," one of them called out, his words slurred with whiskey. "Not in her condition, not in this storm." Victoria closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her fear. 6 months along and showing clearly now, she had become a problem for the men who ran Copper Ridge, a problem they intended to solve before spring arrived and brought with it the complications of a woman giving birth in their rough, lawless settlement. The mining camp had never been meant for families. It had sprung up like a festering wound on the mountainside 3 years ago when Alan Garcia had struck a promising vein of copper ore in the remote Colorado territory. Word had spread quickly through the saloons and gambling halls of Denver, drawing desperate men seeking their fortunes in the unforgiving wilderness. They came with picks and shovels, with dreams of wealth and little regard for comfort or civilization. Women had come too, of course. They always did, some seeking honest work as cooks or laundresses, others plying older trades in the canvas tents in ramshackle buildings that served as the camp's red light district. But Copper Ridge had earned a grim reputation over its short existence. The winters were brutal, the work dangerous, and the men who stayed grew harder with each passing season. Women rarely lasted more than a few months before fleeing back to the relative safety of the towns below. None had ever tried to stay through an entire winter. None had ever been foolish enough to arrive pregnant and alone, carrying a child whose father had abandoned her to the mercy of strangers. Victoria had learned this harsh truth within days of her arrival in late autumn. She had come seeking Kevin Sanders, the charming drifter who had promised to marry her before disappearing into the mountains with talk of striking it rich. The women at the boarding house in town had warned her not to follow him to Copper Ridge, had told her stories of the camp's brutal winters and the fate of women who found themselves stranded there when the snows came. But desperation had driven her forward. With no family to turn to and her condition becoming impossible to hide, she had spent her last coins on passage to the mining camp, clinging to the hope that Kevin would honor his promises and make an honest woman of her. She had found him eventually, found him dealing cards in the back room of Murphy's saloon, his pockets heavy with gold dust, and his arms wrapped around a painted woman half his age. The look in his eyes when he saw her had told her everything she needed to know about his promises and his character. "I never said I'd marry you," he had laughed when she confronted him, his words cutting through her heart like a blade. "A man says lots of things when he's lonely. Doesn't mean he's bound by them." The other men in the saloon had watched the confrontation with cruel amusement, making crude jokes about her condition and speculating loudly about what would become of her when winter set in properly. She had fled then, stumbling through the muddy streets with tears freezing on her cheeks, understanding at last the true nature of her situation. That had been 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks of scraping by on the charity of the camp's few decent souls, sleeping in the corner of the general store in exchange for helping with inventory, and trying to ignore the increasingly hostile stares of the men who saw her as a burden they could not afford. The breaking point had come that morning when Stephen White, the camp's de facto leader and owner of the largest mining claim, had cornered her outside the store with an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. "You need to go," he had said, his weathered face hard as granite. "The boys are getting restless, and winter's only going to get worse. We can't spare food for someone who can't work, and we sure as hell can't deal with a baby come spring. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." Victoria had tried to reason with him, had begged for just a few more months until the baby came and she could find work elsewhere. But White's decision was final. She had until sunset to gather her belongings and leave the camp, or the men would remove her by force. Now, as she huddled in the shadows listening to them hunt for her, Victoria understood that her desperate flight into the storm had only delayed the inevitable. She could not survive the night in the open wilderness. Not in her condition and not in weather that could kill a healthy man in hours. But neither could she surrender herself to the mercy of men who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of. The footsteps were getting closer now, and Victoria knew she had to move. She eased away from the shed, keeping low and trying to muffle her footfalls in the snow. The camp was laid out in a rough grid along the mountainside, with the main mining operations at the bottom and the residential area scattered up the slope. Most of the buildings were dark at this hour. Their occupants either passed out drunk or huddled around their stoves trying to stay warm. She had made it perhaps 50 yards when a voice called out behind her, sharp with discovery. "There, by the assay office." Victoria broke into a stumbling run, her heavy coat hampering her movement and her swollen belly throwing off her balance. The snow was knee-deep in places, and she could hear her pursuers crashing through it behind her, their curses and shouts growing louder with each step. Ahead of her, a light flickered in the window of a small cabin set apart from the others near the edge of the camp. She had noticed it before but had never seen its occupant, had heard only whispered rumors about the man who lived there in solitude. Some said he was a former soldier driven mad by the war. Others claimed he was a wanted man hiding from the law. All agreed that he kept to himself and wanted nothing to do with the troubles of others. But it was the only shelter within reach, and Victoria had no other choice. She stumbled up the rough path to the cabin door and pounded on it with her fist, gasping for breath and glancing back at the lights of her pursuers drawing closer through the storm. "Please," she called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, I need help." For a long moment there was silence, and Victoria felt despair settling over her like a shroud. Then she heard the scrape of a bar being lifted, and the door swung open to reveal a tall figure silhouetted against the warm glow of a fire. The man was older than she had expected, perhaps 40, with graying hair and a beard that had not been trimmed in weeks. His clothes were simple but well made, and his eyes held a wariness that spoke of hard experience. He looked at her for a moment, taking in her condition and the terror written across her face, then stepped aside without a word. Victoria stumbled past him into the cabin's warmth, her legs finally giving out as she collapsed into a chair beside the fire. The man closed the door behind her and dropped the bar back into place, then moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. "How many?" he asked, his voice quiet and controlled. "4, maybe 5, Victoria managed, still struggling to catch her breath. "They want me gone, tonight." The man nodded as if this came as no surprise. "Louis Green," he said, not turning from the window. "And you're the pregnant woman who's been causing such a stir." "Victoria Mitchell," she replied, then added with bitter irony, "though I suppose my reputation precedes me." Louis finally turned from the window, and she could see him studying her with calculating eyes. He was not a handsome man by conventional standards, but there was something solid and dependable about him that reminded her of her father. His cabin was spartanly furnished but clean and well organized, with shelves lined with books and tools arranged with military precision. "They're spreading out," he observed, returning his attention to the window, checking the other buildings. "They'll be here soon enough." Victoria felt her heart sink. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought this to your door. I'll go." "Sit down," Louis said firmly. "You're not going anywhere in this storm, and they know it. Question is what they plan to do when they find you." As if summoned by his words, heavy footsteps sounded on the cabin's front porch, followed by a pounding on the door that made Victoria jump in her chair. "Green," Stephen White's voice boomed from outside. "We know she's in there. Send her out." Louis moved away from the window and stood with his back to the door, his hand resting casually on the grip of a pistol at his hip. Victoria had not noticed the weapon before, but now she could see that he wore it with the easy familiarity of a man who had used it before. "What do you want with her, White?" Louis called back, his voice calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "That's not your concern," White replied. "She's got no business being here. And the boys want her gone. Tonight." "It's my cabin," Louis said. "My business, who I invite inside." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of multiple voices conferring in urgent whispers. Victoria could make out at least 3 different men, possibly more. Her hands moved protectively to her belly as she imagined what they might do if they forced their way inside. "Look, Green," White said finally, his tone taking on a wheedling quality. Nobody wants trouble with you. You've always kept to yourself, and we've respected that. But this woman is a problem for the whole camp. We can't feed her through the winter, and we sure as hell can't deal with a baby come spring. You know how it is. Lewis was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria held her breath waiting for his response. She barely knew this man, had no right to expect his protection, and she could see the wisdom in White's words from a practical standpoint. The camp was a harsh place that operated on harsh rules, and sentiment was a luxury few could afford. I know how it is, Lewis said finally. I also know that turning a pregnant woman out in a blizzard is murder, regardless of how you dress it up. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Victoria could hear the men outside muttering among themselves with growing agitation. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, White warned. There's more of us than you, and we're not leaving without her. Lewis stepped closer to the door, his hand never leaving his weapon. Then I guess we have a problem. The standoff stretched on for several minutes, with the wind howling around the cabin and the fire crackling in the hearth. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, acutely aware that her presence had turned this quiet man's home into a potential battleground. She could see the tension in Louis's shoulders, could sense him calculating odds and considering options. Finally, White spoke again, his voice taking on a more reasonable tone. Look, we don't want bloodshed any more than you do, but facts are facts. She can't stay here through winter, and she can't work in her condition. What exactly do you propose we do with her? That's between her and me, Louis replied, but she's not leaving tonight. And come morning? Louis glanced back at Victoria, and she saw something shift in his expression. We'll figure that out when it comes. There was another long silence. Then the sound of footsteps retreating from the porch. Victoria heard White's voice calling to his men, though she could not make out the words over the storm. After a few minutes, Louis moved back to the window and watched until the lights disappeared back toward the main camp. They're gone, he said, finally holstering his pistol. For now. Victoria let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Thank you, she said quietly. I know you didn't have to do that. Louis shrugged and moved to tend the fire, adding another log to keep the flames burning bright. Man's got to draw lines somewhere. Turning out pregnant women in blizzards crosses mine. But what happens tomorrow, Victoria asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her. They were right about one thing. I can't work in my condition, and I have no way to support myself. I'll just be a burden on whoever tries to help me. Louis was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with an iron rod. You ever done any cooking? Cleaning? Sewing? Of course, Victoria replied, puzzled by the question. I kept house for my father until he died, and I worked as a seamstress in Denver before I got into this situation. Then you can work, Louis said matter-of-factly. Might not be mining work, but it's work all the same. Question is whether the camp's willing to see it that way. Victoria felt a flicker of hope, quickly tempered by realism. And if they're not? Louis met her eyes across the fire, and she saw something there that reminded her of steel being forged in flame. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold, with the storm having blown itself out during the night. Victoria woke to find herself covered with a thick blanket, still sitting in the chair by the fire. Louis was already up, dressed and moving quietly around the cabin as he prepared breakfast. Sleep well? He asked without looking at her. Victoria stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her back. Better than I have in weeks, actually. Thank you for the blanket. Figured you needed it more than I did. Louis set a plate of eggs and bacon on the small table, along with a cup of coffee that smelled like heaven to Victoria's starved senses. Eat up. We've got work to do today. What kind of work? Victoria asked, though she was too hungry to wait for an answer before digging into the food. The kind that proves you're worth keeping around, Louis replied. White and his boys will be back, probably with more men this time. We need to show them you're not just a burden. Over breakfast, Louis laid out his plan. The camp had been operating without anyone to handle the domestic work that kept men fed and their clothes clean. Most of the miners did their own cooking and washing, but the results were predictably poor. If Victoria could establish herself as providing essential services, she might be able to earn her place in the community. It won't be easy, Lewis warned. Most of these men aren't used to dealing with decent women, and they'll test you every chance they get. But if you can prove your worth, even White will have a hard time arguing against keeping you around. Victoria nodded, understanding the logic even as she felt daunted by the challenge. And you? Why are you willing to help me? You don't even know me. Lewis was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. Let's just say I know what it's like to be alone in a hard place with nowhere else to turn. There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, and Victoria sensed that Lewis Green carried his own burdens and secrets. But whatever they were, she was grateful for his help and determined not to waste the opportunity he was giving her. They spent the morning preparing for Victoria's debut as the camp's unofficial housekeeper. Lewis had a surprising amount of fabric and sewing supplies, which he explained had belonged to a woman who had passed through the camp the previous summer. Victoria used them to alter one of her dresses, creating an apron and making herself look more professional and capable. The key, Lewis explained as she worked, is to make yourself indispensable before they have time to think about it too much. Start with the men who are most likely to be sympathetic, then work your way up to the harder cases. And Stephen White? Leave him to me, Lewis said grimly. White and I have an understanding. He knows better than to push me too far. By midday, Victoria felt as ready as she would ever be. Lewis escorted her down to the main part of camp, where the miners were taking their lunch break. The sight of her walking beside the mysterious hermit caused quite a stir, with men stopping their conversations to stare and whisper among themselves. Victoria's first customer was a young miner named Tom, who looked barely old enough to shave. His clothes were filthy and torn, and he had been trying unsuccessfully to sew up a rip in his coat with a piece of string. Let me help you with that, Victoria offered, producing a proper needle and thread from her sewing kit. Tom looked uncertain, glancing around at his fellow miners as if seeking permission. But the cold was bitter, and his coat was his only protection against it. I don't have much money, he admitted. A hot meal would be payment enough, Victoria replied, settling down beside him on a wooden crate and beginning to work on the torn fabric. Within minutes, Victoria had repaired the coat properly, reinforcing the seams and making it stronger than it had been originally. Tom stared at the neat stitching in amazement, running his fingers over the mended area. That's real good work, he said, his voice filled with wonder. My ma used to sew like that, back home in Ohio. Word of Victoria's skill spread quickly through the camp, and soon she had a line of men waiting with torn clothes, missing buttons, and other domestic problems they had been struggling to solve on their own. She worked steadily through the afternoon, accepting payment in the form of food, small coins, or promises of future favors. Lewis watched from a distance, occasionally intervening when one of the miners got too familiar or made inappropriate comments. Victoria noticed that the men treated him with a respect bordering on fear, stepping aside when he approached and moderating their language in his presence. As the sun began to set, Stephen White finally made his appearance. He had been watching the proceedings from his office window, Victoria realized, waiting to see how the experiment would play out. Now he approached with several of his lieutenants, his expression unreadable. Quite an operation you've got going here, he observed, looking at the pile of mended clothes and the satisfied customers. Just trying to be useful, Victoria replied, not looking up from the shirt she was hemming. Useful, White repeated, as if tasting the word. That's one way to put it. Another might be that you're disrupting the natural order of things. Lewis stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. How do you figure that, White? Men come to places like this to get away from domestic complications, White explained. Having a woman around, especially one in her condition, changes things, makes them soft, distracted. Seems to me it makes them cleaner and better dressed, Lewis countered. Hard to see how that's a bad thing. White's eyes narrowed as he studied the two of them. Victoria could sense the wheels turning in his mind, calculating the political implications of the situation. The miners who had benefited from her services were watching the confrontation with obvious interest, and she could see that some of them were prepared to speak up in her defense. Tell you what, White said finally, we'll try it for a week, see how it works out. But at the first sign of trouble, the first fight over her attention or disruption to the work, she goes. Understood? Victoria felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. A week was not much time to prove herself, but it was more than she had dared to hope for that morning. Understood, Lewis replied before she could speak. White nodded curtly and turned to go, then paused and looked back at Victoria. One more thing. You'll be staying in the boarding house with the other women, not in Green's cabin. We may bend the rules, but we don't break them entirely. Victoria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, realizing how her overnight stay must have looked to the rest of the camp. Of course, she managed. I wouldn't want to cause any impropriety. Good, White said with satisfaction. Mrs. Murphy will find you a room. Green can escort you over there when you're finished with your business. The boarding house was a two-story building that served as home to the camp's handful of working women. Mrs. Murphy, a weathered Irish woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, showed Victoria to a small room on the second floor. It's not much, she admitted, but it's clean and warm. Meals are included, though you'll be expected to help with the cooking and cleaning to earn your keep. Victoria looked around the tiny space with its single bed, washstand, and small window overlooking the main street. After weeks of uncertainty, it felt like luxury. It's perfect, she said sincerely. Thank you. Mrs. Murphy studied her with shrewd eyes. You're the one who's got everyone talking. The pregnant girl who stood up to Stephen White. I'm not sure I'd put it quite that way, Victoria replied carefully. No, well, however you want to put it, you've stirred things up around here. Some of the girls are calling you brave, others are calling you foolish. Me, I'm reserving judgment until I see how this plays out. That evening, Victoria joined the other women for dinner in the boarding house's common room. There were 5 of them in total, ranging in age from barely 18 to perhaps 35. They worked as saloon girls, laundresses, and cooks, providing the limited feminine presence that kept the camp from being entirely masculine. The conversation was initially awkward, with the women clearly uncertain how to treat someone in Victoria's condition. But as the evening wore on and Victoria proved herself to be neither judgmental nor threatening, the atmosphere relaxed considerably. So what's your story? Asked Emma Collins, a blonde woman who worked as a dealer in Murphy's saloon. How'd you end up in this godforsaken place? Victoria found herself telling them about Kevin Sanders and his broken promises, about her desperate journey to the camp and her confrontation with Stephen White. The women listened with expressions ranging from sympathy to cynicism. Men, said Marie Martin, the oldest of the group, with a bitter laugh, they're all the same when it comes down to it, full of pretty words until reality sets in. Not all of them, protested Lisa White, a young woman who worked as a cook. There are some decent ones around. Name one, Marie challenged. Lewis Green, Lisa said immediately. He helped Victoria when no one else would. The room fell silent at the mention of Lewis's name, and Victoria sensed undercurrents she did not understand. What is it? She asked. What's wrong with Lewis? Emma and Marie exchanged glances as if debating how much to reveal. Nothing's wrong with him exactly, Emma said finally. He's just complicated. Been here longer than almost anyone, but keeps to himself. Some say he's running from something back east. Others say he lost his family in the war, added Lisa quietly. That's why he doesn't like to get too close to people. Victoria thought about Lewis's kindness to her, his willingness to risk confrontation with Stephen White on her behalf. Whatever secrets he carried, she was grateful for his protection. He seems like a good man to me, she said simply. Maybe, Marie replied, but good men in places like this often have the darkest pasts. Just be careful, honey. The last thing you need is to get tangled up with another man who will disappoint you. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Victoria threw herself into establishing her place in the camp's economy. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. Murphy with breakfast, then spent her mornings taking in sewing and mending work from the miners. Afternoons were devoted to laundry, a back-breaking task that left her exhausted but provided steady income. The work was harder than anything she had done before, made more difficult by her advancing pregnancy. But Victoria found strength she had not known she possessed, driven by the knowledge that failure meant exile and almost certain death in the wilderness. Lewis checked on her regularly, though he was careful to maintain a proper distance that would not fuel gossip. He brought her small gifts of food and supplies, claiming they were payment for mending his clothes, though Victoria suspected his motives were more charitable. "How are you holding up?" he asked one afternoon, finding her hanging laundry behind the boarding house despite the bitter cold. "Well enough," Victoria replied, though she could not hide the exhaustion in her voice. "Mrs. Murphy says I'm earning my keep, and some of the miners have started bringing me regular work." "That's good," Lewis said, though his expression remained troubled. "What about the baby? When is it due?" Victoria paused in her work, one hand moving instinctively to her belly. "Late spring, I think. Maybe early summer. It's hard to be certain." Lewis nodded, and she could see him calculating months and seasons in his head. "That gives us time to figure things out. Make sure you have what you need when the time comes." "Us?" Victoria asked, surprised by his use of the plural. Lewis seemed to realize what he had said and looked uncomfortable. "I just meant, well, someone needs to think about these things. Make sure there's a plan." Victoria felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of her work. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "You'd have figured something out," Lewis replied gruffly. "You're stronger than you think." As the week progressed, Victoria began to notice changes in the camp's atmosphere. The miners who had initially viewed her with suspicion or hostility were becoming rustic, taking pride in their clean clothes and well-mended equipment. They began bringing her small problems beyond sewing, asking her advice on everything from cooking to letter writing. More importantly, productivity in the mines actually increased rather than decreased. The men worked harder and more efficiently, knowing that hot meals and clean clothes waited for them at the end of their shifts. Even Stephen White seemed grudgingly impressed by the transformation. But not everyone was pleased with Victoria's growing influence. Kevin Sanders, the man who had brought her to this situation, watched her success with obvious resentment. He had been drinking more heavily since her arrival, and his gambling had become increasingly reckless. The confrontation Victoria had been dreading finally came on Saturday night in Murphy's saloon. She had been delivering a mended shirt to one of the miners when Kevin cornered her near the bar, his breath reeking of whiskey and his eyes bloodshot with drink. "Well, look who's become the camp princess," he sneered, swaying slightly on his feet. "Got yourself a nice little setup here, don't you?" Victoria tried to step around him, but Kevin blocked her path. The saloon had grown quiet, with other patrons watching the drama unfold with morbid interest. "Excuse me," Victoria said firmly. "I need to get back to work." "Work," Kevin laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call it? Playing house with that hermit Green, making these fools think they need a woman to take care of them?" "That's enough," said a voice from behind Victoria. She turned to see Lewis approaching, his expression dark as a thundercloud. Kevin's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "Well, well, here comes the knight in shining armor. Tell me, Green, how much are you paying for her services, or is it more of a trade arrangement?" The implication hit Victoria like a physical blow, and she felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Around the saloon, men shifted uncomfortably, some looking away in embarrassment, while others leaned forward eagerly, anticipating violence. Lewis moved with surprising speed for such a large man. One moment Kevin was standing upright, the next he was pinned against the bar, with Lewis's forearm pressed against his throat. "Apologize," Lewis said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than a shout would have. Kevin struggled against the hold, his face turning red. "Go to hell," he gasped. Lewis pressed harder, and Kevin's eyes began to bulge. Around them, the saloon held his collective breath. "The lady is under my protection," Lewis said, his voice still calm and controlled. "Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. Anyone who threatens her threatens me. Are we clear?" Kevin nodded frantically, and Louis released him. The younger man collapsed against the bar, gasping and rubbing his throat. "Now apologize," Lewis commanded. Kevin looked around the room, seeing no sympathy in the faces watching him. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, not meeting Victoria's eyes. "I was drunk. Didn't mean nothing by it." "Apology accepted," Victoria said with more grace than she felt. "But I think it would be best if we avoided each other in the future." Kevin nodded and slunk away toward the back rooms, his humiliation complete. Lewis watched him go, then turned to Victoria with concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" Victoria nodded, though she was shaking slightly from the confrontation. "Thank you, again." "Don't mention it," Lewis replied, then looked around the saloon at the watching faces. "I think we should go." They walked back to the boarding house in silence, the cold night air helping to clear Victoria's head. Only when they reached the front porch did she finally speak. "He was right about one thing," she said quietly. "What's that?" "I have been playing house, haven't I? Pretending that this arrangement can last, that I can build a real life here." Victoria looked up at the stars scattered across the winter sky. "But what happens when the baby comes? What happens when I can't work anymore?" Lewis was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could see her breath misting in the frigid air. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "Together." There was something in his tone that made Victoria look at him more closely. In the moonlight, she could see emotions playing across his weathered features that she had not noticed before. "Lewis," she said carefully, "why are you helping me? Really?" He met her eyes for a moment, then looked away toward the mountains looming in the darkness. "Because everyone deserves a chance," he said simply, "and because some mistakes shouldn't have to be paid for with a life." The next morning brought news that changed everything. A rider had arrived during the night with word that the railroad was planning to extend a spur line into the valley, potentially connecting Copper Ridge to the outside world for the first time. The implications were staggering, both for the camp's future and for Victoria's situation. Stephen White called a meeting in the saloon to discuss the development, and for the first time since her arrival, Victoria was invited to attend. She sat in the back of the room with Mrs. Murphy and the other women, listening as White outlined the opportunities and challenges ahead. "If the railroad comes through, we're looking at a real town here," White explained to the assembled miners. "Proper buildings, regular supply runs, maybe even families settling permanently. But that means changes, and not all of them will be easy." The discussion that followed was heated, with some men excited about the prospect of civilization, while others worried about losing the rough independence that had drawn them to the frontier. Victoria found herself thinking about what a real town would mean for her and her unborn child. Regular medical care, schools, a chance at a normal life. But she also understood that such changes were still months or years away, while her baby was due in a matter of weeks. The immediate challenges remained unchanged, regardless of what the future might hold. After the meeting, Lewis walked with her back to the boarding house, both of them lost in thought about what they had heard. "What do you think?" Victoria asked. "Will the railroad really come?" "Maybe," Lewis replied. "These things have a way of taking longer than expected, if they happen at all. A lot of promises get made that never get kept." Victoria heard the bitterness in his voice and wondered what promises had been broken in his own past. "But if it does happen, then everything changes," Lewis said simply, "for all of us." That night, Victoria lay awake thinking about the future and the choices that lay ahead. The baby kicked restlessly as if sensing her anxiety, and she found herself talking softly to the child she had not yet met. "What kind of world am I bringing you into?" she whispered, her hand stroking her swollen belly. "Will this be a place where you can grow up safe and happy? Or will we always be struggling just to survive?" The questions had no easy answers, but Victoria found herself thinking more and more about Lewis and the unexpected partnership that had developed between them. He had become her protector and ally, but she sensed there could be something deeper if they both had the courage to explore it. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Her experience with Kevin had taught her to be wary of trusting her heart to any man, and Lewis remained largely a mystery despite their growing closeness. But there was something solid and dependable about him that drew her like a moth to flame. The next few weeks passed in a routine of work and gradual acceptance. Victoria's position in the camp became more secure as her services proved increasingly valuable. She had expanded beyond simple sewing to include cooking special meals for celebrations, writing letters for illiterate miners, and even providing basic medical care for minor injuries. Her pregnancy advanced steadily, making some tasks more difficult, but also earning her a grudging respect from the men who saw her determination to keep working despite her condition. Even Stephen White seemed to have accepted her permanent presence, though he still watched her with calculating eyes. Lewis remained a constant presence in her life, though always careful to maintain proper boundaries. He brought her books to read during the long winter evenings, helped her with the heavier aspects of her work, and gradually began sharing more of his own story. He had indeed been a soldier during the war, she learned, serving as a cavalry officer in some of the conflict's bloodiest battles. His family, a wife and young daughter, had died of fever while he was away fighting, leaving him with guilt and grief that had driven him to seek isolation in the wilderness. I told myself I came here to find gold, he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire in the boarding house common room. But really I came here to forget, to find some place where the past couldn't follow me. And has it worked? Victoria asked gently. Lewis looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain she was only beginning to understand. Until recently, I thought it had. But some things can't be forgotten, only learned to live with. Victoria felt her heart ache for him, understanding now why he had been so willing to help her. They were both refugees from their past, seeking redemption in an unforgiving landscape. Maybe forgetting isn't the answer, she said carefully. Maybe the answer is finding something worth remembering. Lewis met her eyes across the fire, and Victoria saw something kindle there that made her pulse quicken. For a moment, the air between them crackled with possibility, with the promise of something that could heal them both. Then the moment passed, and Lewis looked away, the walls coming back up around his heart. Maybe, he said quietly, but some risks are too dangerous to take. Victoria wanted to argue, to tell him that love was always a risk worth taking, but she understood his caution. She carried her own scars from trusting too quickly, and the stakes were higher now with a child to consider. But as winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains and the first hints of spring appeared in the lengthening days, Victoria found herself hoping that time and patience might yet overcome the barriers between them. The crisis that would test them all came without warning on a gray morning in early March. Victoria woke to find blood staining her nightgown and sharp pains shooting through her abdomen. The baby was coming, weeks earlier than expected, and in circumstances that could hardly have been worse. Mrs. Murphy took charge immediately, sending one of the girls to fetch the camp's only doctor, a former Army surgeon named Patterson, who was better known for treating gunshot wounds than delivering babies. Lewis appeared at the boarding house within minutes of being summoned, his face pale with worry. "How is she?" he demanded. "Not good," Mrs. Murphy replied grimly. "The baby's coming too early, and she's losing blood. Patterson's on his way, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew the limitations of frontier medicine, especially when it came to childbirth complications. Lewis pushed past her toward the stairs, but Mrs. Murphy caught his arm. "You can't go up there," she said firmly. "This is women's work." "Like hell," Louis replied, shaking off her grip. "She needs me." Victoria's labor lasted 18 hours, a nightmare of pain and fear that tested everyone involved. Dr. Patterson did his best with limited supplies and experience, while Mrs. Murphy and the other women provided what comfort they could. Lewis paced the common room below, wearing a path in the wooden floor, as he listened to Victoria's cries echoing from above. Several times during the long ordeal, it seemed they might lose both mother and child. Victoria hemorrhaged badly early in the labor, requiring Dr. Patterson to perform procedures that would have been dangerous even in a proper hospital. The baby's heartbeat grew weak and irregular, causing the doctor to consider interventions that carried their own terrible risks. But Victoria fought with a determination that amazed everyone present. Even when the pain became unbearable and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she refused to give up. She had come too far and survived too much to surrender now. "Come on, honey," Mrs. Murphy urged during the worst moments. "Your baby needs you to be strong. We all need you to be strong." And somehow Victoria found the strength to continue. When her daughter finally arrived in the early hours of dawn, she was small and pale but breathing, her tiny fists clenched as if ready to fight the world that had tried to claim her before she was born. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Murphy whispered, wrapping the infant in clean blankets. "Small, but perfect." Victoria reached out with trembling hands to hold her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she looked into the tiny features that were already so precious to her. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." The baby opened her eyes then, dark blue like her mother's, and seemed to study Victoria's face with solemn intensity. In that moment, Victoria felt something shift inside her, a fierce, protective awe that made all her previous struggles seem insignificant. "What will you call her?" asked Lisa White, who had assisted throughout the delivery. Victoria looked down at her daughter, thinking of all the hardships they had already faced together and all the challenges that lay ahead. "Grace," she said finally. "Her name is Grace." When Lewis was finally allowed upstairs to see them, Victoria had never seen such raw emotion on a man's face. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the sight of mother and child, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She's perfect," he said hoarsely. "Absolutely perfect." Victoria smiled, exhausted but radiant with joy. "Would you like to hold her?" Lewis approached the bed with reverent tears, accepting the tiny bundle as if she were made of spun glass. Grace studied his weathered features with the same solemn intensity she had shown her mother, and Lewis's face softened in a way Victoria had never seen before. "Hello, little Grace," he murmured. "You gave us quite a scare there." The baby made a soft sound, almost as if she were responding to his voice, and Lewis smiled with pure wonder. "She likes you," Victoria observed. "The feeling is mutual," Lewis replied, still gazing down at the infant with amazement. "She's going to be a fighter, this one. Has to be, growing up in a place like this." Victoria felt a shadow cross her heart at his words. Grace was beautiful and perfect, but she was also completely dependent and vulnerable. How could they possibly raise a child in a rough mining camp where violence and hardship were daily realities? As if reading her thoughts, Lewis looked up and met her eyes. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, using that word again that had come to mean so much to her. "Whatever it takes, we'll make sure she has what she needs." The next few days passed in a blur of recovery and adjustment. Victoria's strength returned slowly, aided by the surprisingly good care she received from the other women in the boarding house. Word of Grace's birth had spread quickly through the camp, and even the roughest miners seemed affected by the presence of new life in their harsh world. Gifts began arriving at the boarding house, simple offerings from men who had little to spare but wanted to contribute something to the baby's welfare. Hand-carved toys, soft blankets knitted from unraveled sweaters, even a tiny rocking cradle built by the camp's carpenter from precious scraps of good wood. Stephen White visited on the third day, ostensibly to check on Victoria's condition, but really to assess the situation created by Grace's arrival. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable in the domestic setting. "She's healthy?" he asked without preamble. "Very healthy," Victoria replied, holding Grace protectively. "Dr. Patterson says she should thrive despite being early." White nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's good. That's real good." He stood there for another moment, seeming to struggle with something, then finally spoke again. "Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot when you first arrived. Maybe I was too quick to judge the situation. But having a baby in camp, that changes things. Changes them in ways we haven't thought through yet." Victoria felt her heart sink. "Are you saying we have to leave?" "No," White said quickly. "No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that we need to think about what kind of place this is getting to be. Whether we want to be just another rough mining camp that comes and goes, or something more permanent, something that could be home to families." Victoria stared at him in surprise, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "The railroad's survey team is coming through in a few weeks," White continued. "If they like what they see, if they think we're the kind of community worth connecting to civilization, then everything changes. Your little girl there might grow up in a real town instead of a mining camp." "And if they don't?" Victoria asked. White's expression grew somber. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But either way, you and the baby have a place here. Both of you have earned that much." After White left, Victoria sat holding Grace and trying to process what had just happened. The man who had once threatened to throw her out into a blizzard was now talking about building a community around families like hers. The transformation seemed too good to be true. Lewis arrived that evening with his usual offering of food and supplies, but also with something else, a small wooden box that he set carefully on the table beside Victoria's bed. "What is it?" she asked. "Open it and see." Inside the box, nestled in soft cloth, was a delicate silver locket on a thin chain. Victoria lifted it carefully, admiring the intricate engraving on its surface. "It was my wife's," Lewis said quietly. "I want Grace to have it. Something to remember her by when she's older." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. "Lewis, I can't accept this. It's too precious." "It's been sitting in that box for 5 years, doing nobody any good," Lewis replied. "Sarah would have wanted it to go to a child who needed it, someone who could carry it forward instead of letting it gather dust." Victoria opened the locket and found a tiny photograph inside. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile holding a small girl who looked to be about 3 years old. "Your family," Victoria whispered. "My family," Lewis confirmed. "Sarah and little Emma. They would have loved Grace, I think. Would have loved you too." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Victoria looked up at Lewis, seeing past the walls he had built around his heart to the man beneath, the one who was capable of great love despite his losses. "Lewis," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know what you're going to say," he said gently, "and maybe someday, when we've both had time to heal properly, we can talk about it. But right now, Grace needs to be your focus. She needs you to be strong and whole, not distracted by an old soldier's baggage." Victoria wanted to argue, to tell him that love didn't have to be a distraction, that it could be a source of strength instead. But she also understood his caution, his need to protect himself and them from the pain of another loss. "Will you at least stay close?" she asked. "Help me raise her?" Lewis smiled, the first truly happy expression she had seen on his face since they met. "Try and stop me." The railroad survey team arrived on a warm day in late April, when the snow had finally melted from all but the highest peaks and the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the meadows around the camp. Victoria watched from her window as the three-man team rode into town, their neat clothes and official bearing marking them as representatives of the outside world. Stephen White had spent weeks preparing for their visit, organizing the miners to clean up the camp and present their best face to the surveyors. Buildings had been repaired and painted, the main street cleared of debris, and the saloon instructed to maintain some semblance of order during the team's stay. Victoria had her own preparations to make. At 2 months old, Grace was thriving, growing plump and alert under the devoted care of her mother and the protective attention of the entire camp. But Victoria knew that the surveyor's report could determine whether Grace would grow up in a civilized town during a dying mining camp. Lewis had been working with Victoria to establish a more formal business, helping her set up a proper laundry and seamstress shop that could serve not just the current miners, but the families that might come if the railroad arrived. They had converted a small building near the boarding house into a workshop, complete with proper equipment and supplies ordered from Denver. "Remember," Lewis coached her as they watched the surveyors begin their inspection of the camp, "they're not just looking at the mining potential. They want to see a community that can support regular service, that has the stability to justify the investment." Victoria nodded, understanding the subtext. A mining camp full of transient men was one thing, but a town with families and children was quite another. Grace's presence and Victoria's success in establishing herself as a permanent resident could be crucial factors in the surveyor's decision. The inspection lasted 3 days, with the team examining everything from the mining operations to the quality of the buildings to the character of the residents. Victoria made sure to be visible during their visit, working in her shop with Grace sleeping peacefully in a cradle nearby, presenting the image of domestic stability that the railroad would want to see. On the second day, the lead surveyor, a distinguished gentleman named Harrison, stopped by her shop to examine her work. He picked up several examples of her sewing, testing the quality of the stitches and the durability of the repairs. "Fine work," he commented approvingly. "You learned this trade back east?" "Yes, sir," Victoria replied. "In Denver, before I came here." "And you plan to stay? Raise your child here?" Victoria looked down at Grace, who was awake and watching the stranger with curious eyes. "This is our home now," she said simply. "We're part of this community." Harrison nodded and made notes in his ledger, then moved on to examine other aspects of the camp. But Victoria felt encouraged by his interest and his apparent approval of what he had seen. The surveyor's final meeting with the camp leadership was held in Murphy's saloon, with most of the residents crowding in to hear their verdict. Victoria stood in the back with Grace in her arm, Lewis beside her, both of them tense with anticipation. Harrison stood at the front of the room, his expression giving nothing away as he consulted his notes one final time. "Gentlemen," he began, "we've completed our survey of Copper Ridge and the surrounding area. I'll be direct with you about our findings." The room held its collective breath. "The mineral deposits here are substantial enough to justify rail service, but that alone wouldn't be enough to recommend extending the line this far into the mountains. The cost would be too high for a purely extractive operation that might play out in a few years." Victoria felt her heart sink, but Harrison wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "we've also observed something here that's unusual in mining camps of this type. You've got the beginnings of a real community with permanent residents, established businesses, and the kind of stability that suggests long-term viability." He looked directly at Victoria as he spoke, and she felt a flush of pride at being singled out. "Our recommendation will be that the railroad extends service to Copper Ridge, contingent on the community's commitment to continued development as a permanent settlement rather than a temporary mining camp." The room erupted in cheers and celebration, with men slapping each other on the back and buying rounds of drinks for everyone present. Victoria felt tears of relief and joy streaming down her face as she hugged Grace close. "We did it," she whispered to Lewis. "We actually did it." Lewis smiled and put his arm around both of them, pulling them close in a gesture that felt completely natural despite the public setting. "You did it," he corrected. "You proved that this place could be home to a family. That made all the difference." The celebration continued long into the night, but Victoria and Lewis slipped away early to walk along the creek that ran behind the camp. Grace slept peacefully in Victoria's arms, lulled by the gentle motion and the sound of flowing water. "So what happens now?" Victoria asked as they found a fallen log to sit on beside the water. "Now we build a town," Lewis replied. "Real houses instead of shacks. A proper school for Grace and the other children who will come. Maybe even a church if we can find a preacher willing to brave the mountains." Victoria looked out at the moonlight dancing on the water and tried to imagine the future Louis was describing. It seemed almost too wonderful to believe after everything they had been through. "And us?" she asked quietly. "What happens to us?" Louis was silent for a long moment, and Victoria could see him wrestling with emotions he had kept buried for so long. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally. "About what Sarah would want from me, what would honor her memory best." Victoria waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I think she'd want me to live," Lewis continued. "Really live, not just exist. She'd want me to find happiness again, to build something good from the ashes of what we lost." He turned to face Victoria, and she could see the walls around his heart finally crumbling. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you and Grace both, more than I ever thought I could love anyone again. And if you'll have me, if you can accept a man with a complicated past and scars that may never fully heal, I'd like to try building that future together." Victoria felt her heart soar as she looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his words reflected there. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." They kissed then, gently and carefully, with Grace sleeping peacefully between them and the sound of the creek providing a gentle soundtrack to their promise. It was not the passionate embrace of young lovers, but something deeper and more precious, the joining of two wounded souls who had found healing in each other. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a perfect June morning, with the mountains providing a majestic backdrop and wildflowers carpeting the meadows in brilliant color. It was the first wedding in Copper Ridge's short history, and the entire community turned out to celebrate. Victoria wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric ordered specially from Denver, simple but elegant, with lace trim that caught the morning sunlight. Grace, now 4 months old and growing more beautiful each day, slept peacefully in Mrs. Murphy's arms during the ceremony. Dr. Patterson, in addition to his medical duties, turned out to be an ordained minister, a fact he had kept quiet until Victoria and Louis Boy approached him about performing the ceremony. He conducted the service with dignity and warmth, speaking about love that grows from shared hardship and the courage required to build new lives from the ruins of old ones. "Do you, Louis Green, take Victoria Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish through whatever trials and joys may come?" "I do," Lewis replied, his voice strong and certain. And do you, Victoria Mitchell, take Lewis Green to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish through whatever trials and joys may come? Victoria looked into Lewis's eyes and saw their entire future reflected there. All the challenges and blessings that lay ahead. I do, she said with absolute conviction. When they kissed to seal their vows, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Even Stephen White, who had initially opposed Victoria's presence in the camp, was seen wiping his eyes during the ceremony. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing in the main street and enough food and drink to feed twice their number. Victoria found herself passed from partner to partner as the miners took turns dancing with the bride, each of them offering their congratulations and best wishes for her future happiness. But the moment she treasured most came when Lewis took Grace in his arms and danced slowly with her while Victoria watched from the sidelines. The sight of this strong, weathered man holding her tiny daughter with such tenderness brought tears to her eyes and confirmed what she had known in her heart for months. Grace had found a father, and Victoria had found the partner she had never dared to hope for. The railroad arrived that fall, bringing with it the first regular supply trains and the promise of easier connection to the outside world. But it also brought changes that transformed Copper Ridge from a rough mining camp into a proper frontier town. New businesses opened to serve the railroad workers and the increasing number of families who came seeking opportunities in the growing community. A school was established with Victoria serving as the first teacher, using the education she had received back east to prepare the next generation for the challenges and opportunities of frontier life. Lewis expanded his mining operation, but also became involved in town government, his natural leadership abilities and reputation for fairness making him a natural choice for mayor when the position was created. Together, he and Victoria became pillars of the community they had helped to build. Grace thrived in this environment, growing into a bright and curious child who was beloved by everyone in town. She had no memory of the desperate circumstances of her birth, knowing only the love and security that surrounded her from her earliest days. By her second birthday, she was walking and talking, charming the miners with her fearless exploration of their world and her ability to remember everyone's name. Victoria often found her in Louis's workshop, helping him with projects by handing him tools or simply sitting quietly and watching him work. She's going to be a builder like her father, Victoria observed one afternoon, watching Grace stack blocks with intense concentration. Her father? Louis looked up from the rocking horse he was carving for Grace's birthday. Victoria smiled at his surprise. That's what she calls you. That's what you are. Louis set down his carving tools and pulled Victoria into his arms, holding her close as they watched Grace play. Sometimes I can't believe this is real, he admitted, that I get to have this life, this family, after everything that happened before Mao. It's real, Victoria assured him. We made it real together. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace looked up from her blocks and toddled over to them, raising her arms to be picked up. Louis scooped her up and spun her around, eliciting delighted giggles that filled the workshop with joy. "Papa fly," Grace demanded, and Louis obliged, lifting her high above his head while she spread her arms like wings. Victoria watched them play and felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate woman who had fled into a blizzard 3 years ago seemed like a stranger now, though Victoria carried the lessons of that experience with her always. She had learned that strength could be found in the most unlikely places, that love could grow from the ashes of despair, and that sometimes the most precious gifts came wrapped in the most challenging circumstances. Grace would grow up in a world very different from the one Victoria had known, a world where women could build businesses and contribute to their communities, where families were valued and protected, where children could dream of futures limited only by their imagination and determination. But she would also grow up knowing the story of her birth, understanding the courage and sacrifice that had made her life possible. Victoria was determined that her daughter would never take for granted the security and opportunities that had been fought for and won through hardship and determination. The 5th anniversary of Grace's birth was marked by the completion of the town's first proper church, a modest but beautiful building that stood as a symbol of Copper Ridge's transformation from mining camp to permanent community. Victoria had contributed significantly to the building fund through her successful seamstress business, which now employed 3 other women and served customers throughout the region. The dedication service was attended by representatives from the territorial government, railroad officials, and families from neighboring communities who had heard about the remarkable town that had grown up in the shadow of the mountains. Victoria sat in the front pew with Louis and Grace, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment as she looked around at the faces of friends and neighbors who had become her chosen family. Grace, now a precocious 5-year-old with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady gray eyes, fidgeted impatiently through the ceremony. She was more interested in the wildflowers she had picked that morning than in the speeches about community and progress. But Victoria didn't mind. There would be time enough for Grace to understand the significance of what they had built here. After the service, the congregation gathered for a picnic in the meadow behind the church. Children ran and played while their parents shared food and conversation. The easy camaraderie of people who had worked together to build something lasting and good. Victoria found herself standing apart from the crowd for a moment, watching Louis teach Grace and several other children how to skip stones in the creek. The sight filled her with such contentment that she almost didn't notice Stephen White approaching until he spoke. "Quite a change from the old days," he observed, following her gaze to the happy scene before them. "Indeed it is," Victoria agreed. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how far we've come." White was quiet for a moment, then spoke with uncharacteristic emotion in his voice. "I owe you an apology, for how I treated you when you first arrived. I was wrong about a lot of things back then." Victoria turned to study his weathered face, seeing genuine remorse there. "We were all different people then, Stephen. We did what we thought we had to do to survive." "Maybe," White replied, "but you saw something the rest of us missed. You saw that survival wasn't enough, that we needed to build something worth surviving for." Before Victoria could respond, Grace came running over to them, her dress muddy and her face bright with excitement. "Mama, Papa taught me to make the stones jump on the water. Want to see?" "Of course I do, sweetheart," Victoria replied, taking Grace's small hand in hers. "Show me everything." As they walked toward the creek together, Victoria reflected on the truth of White's words. Survival had never been enough for her, even in the darkest moments of that first winter. She had always been reaching for something more, something that would make the struggle worthwhile. Now, watching her daughter laugh with delight as she successfully skipped a stone across the water while Louis cheered her accomplishment, Victoria knew she had found what she had been searching for. Not just safety or security, but a life filled with love and purpose and the endless possibility of tomorrow. The sun was setting behind the mountains as the celebration began to wind down, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Families gathered their children and prepared to head home, but Victoria lingered by the creek with Louis and Grace, reluctant to let the perfect day end. "Tell me the story, Mama," Grace requested, settling herself on Louis's lap as they sat on the grassy bank. "Tell me about when I was born." It had become a bedtime ritual, this telling of Grace's origin story, though Victoria always edited it carefully for young ears. She spoke of the brave woman who had come to the mountains seeking a new life, of the kind man who had helped her when she needed it most, and of the beautiful baby who had brought joy to everyone who met her. "And then what happened?" Grace prompted, though she knew the story by heart. "Then the railroad came and our little camp became a real town, and we all lived happily ever after," Victoria concluded, as she always did. "Like in the fairy tales?" "Better than fairy tales," Louis interjected, pulling both his wife and daughter close. "Because this story is real and it's ours." Grace yawned and snuggled deeper into Louis's embrace, her eyelids growing heavy as the day's excitement caught up with her. Victoria watched her daughter's peaceful face and thought about all the stories Grace would create for herself in the years to come, all the adventures and challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. The little girl who had been born in a blizzard to a desperate mother would grow up to be anything she chose to be. She would attend the school her mother had helped to establish, learn from books ordered specially from back east, and dream dreams that stretched far beyond the mountains that surrounded their valley. But she would also carry with her the values that had built this community, the understanding that true strength came from helping others, that love could conquer even the harshest circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were found in the most unlikely places. As they finally made their way home through the gathering dusk, Victoria felt a deep sense of completion. The frightened woman who had stumbled through a snowstorm 5 years ago had found not just survival, but transformation, not just shelter, but home, not just safety, but love. The journey had been difficult, filled with moments of despair and uncertainty that had tested her resolve to its limits. But every step had been worth it to arrive at this moment. Walking through the streets of the town they had helped to build, surrounded by the family they had created together. Grace fell asleep in Lewis's arms before they reached their house, her small body completely relaxed in the security of his embrace. Victoria opened the door and watched as Lewis carried their daughter upstairs to her bedroom, his movements gentle and sure. This was what she had been fighting for during those dark winter nights when the future seemed impossible to imagine. This quiet domestic happiness, this sense of belonging, this knowledge that she had found her place in the world and made it beautiful. Standing in the doorway of Grace's room, watching Lewis tuck their daughter into bed with the tenderness of a man who had learned to treasure every moment of peace, Victoria felt the last of her old fears finally slip away. She had spent so many years afraid of trusting her heart, afraid of believing that happiness could last, afraid that the next disaster was always waiting just around the corner. But 5 years of building a life together had taught her that while challenges would always come, love was stronger than fear, and hope was more powerful than despair. The woman who had once been so desperate that she had considered surrender now stood as a pillar of her community, a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother, and a beloved wife. Grace stirred as Lewis kissed her forehead, mumbling sleepily about stone skipping and church picnics and all the wonders of her secure little world. Victoria smiled, knowing that her daughter would grow up taking for granted the very things that had once seemed impossible to achieve. That was as it should be. Each generation should build upon the sacrifices of the one before, reaching higher and dreaming bigger because they stood on the shoulders of those who had fought to give them that opportunity. "Sweet dreams, little one," Victoria whispered, adding her own kiss to Louis's. "Tomorrow will bring new adventures." They left Grace's room and walked hand in hand to their own bedroom, where the window looked out over the town they had helped to create. Lights twinkled in windows throughout the valley, each one representing a family, a dream, a story of courage and determination that had brought them to this place. "Do you ever regret it?" Lewis asked quietly as they stood together, looking out at their domain. "Leaving the civilized world behind for this frontier life?" Victoria considered the question seriously, thinking about the comfortable life she might have had if she had made different choices, if she had been content with safety and convention instead of reaching for something more. "Never," she said firmly. "This is where I was meant to be, where we were meant to be." Lewis pulled her closer, and Victoria felt the solid strength of his embrace surrounding her like a shield against whatever storms might come. They had weathered so much together already, had proven that their love could survive any test that life might devise. "I love you," he said, the words still carrying the wonder of a man who had thought such feelings were lost to him forever. "I love you too," Victoria replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "All of you, all of this, everything we've built together." Outside their window, the town settled into peaceful slumber, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for growth and prosperity. The railroad whistle sounded in the distance, a reminder of their connection to the wider world and the endless possibilities that lay beyond the mountains. But Victoria felt no urge to chase those distant horizons. She had found her home, her purpose, her happiness in this valley where a desperate woman had once sought shelter from a storm and discovered instead the love of her life and the family she had never dared to dream of. The baby who had been born in the darkest hour of winter had grown into a bright and beautiful child who would carry their story forward into whatever future awaited. Grace would know challenges of her own, would face decisions and obstacles that would test her character and determination. But she would face them with the strength that came from being loved unconditionally, from growing up in a community that valued courage and compassion, from knowing that she was the daughter of parents who had refused to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only reasonable choice. As Victoria drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. Every hardship had been worth enduring, every fear worth conquering, every risk worth taking to arrive at this place where love had triumphed over despair and hope had proven stronger than the harshest winter. The woman who had once been told that no woman lasted until spring in Copper Ridge had not only survived but thrived, transforming herself and her community in the process. She had refused to leave before her baby came, and in that refusal had found the strength to build a life more beautiful than any she had dared to imagine. In the morning there would be new challenges to face, new dreams to pursue, new chapters to write in the ongoing story of their remarkable town. But tonight, Victoria Mitchell Green slept peacefully in the home she had fought to create, surrounded by the love she had earned through courage and determination. Secure in the knowledge that she had found her place in the world and made it beautiful. The mountains stood sentinel around their valley, eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the transformation of a rough mining camp into a thriving community where families could put down roots and children could grow up safe and loved. And at the heart of it all was the story of a pregnant woman who had refused to give up, who had insisted on staying until spring came, and who had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures were found in the most unlikely places. The wind that had once carried threats and danger now whispered lullabies through the trees, and the snow that had once seemed like an enemy now promised the water that would feed their crops and sustain their community for generations to come. Everything had changed, and yet the essential truth remained the same. Love was stronger than fear, hope more powerful than despair, and the human spirit capable of creating beauty and meaning even in the harshest circumstances. Victoria's story had become the founding legend of Copper Ridge, told and retold to newcomers and children as an example of what could be accomplished when courage met opportunity and determination refused to accept defeat. But for Victoria herself, it was simply the beginning of a life lived fully and completely, surrounded by the family she cherished in the community she had helped to build. The pregnant woman who had refused to leave before her baby came had indeed lasted until spring and far beyond. She had lasted long enough to see her daughter grow strong and beautiful, long enough to watch her town flourish and prosper, long enough to prove that sometimes the most impossible dreams were simply the ones that required the most courage to pursue. And in the quiet hours of that perfect night, with her husband's arms around her and her daughter sleeping peacefully down the hall, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that every moment of struggle had been worth it to arrive at this place of perfect contentment, where love had conquered all and spring had come at last to stay.